The accusation. Robert Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan penthouse, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a glittering circuit board. At 42, he had built a tech empire worth billions, but success had carved deep lines around his steel-gray eyes and turned his heart to stone. His mansion employed 15 people, yet he knew none of their names beyond what appeared on their paychecks. The penthouse gleamed with cold perfection. Italian marble floors reflected crystal chandeliers, and every surface sparkled under the careful attention of his cleaning staff. Among them worked Nina Rodriguez, a 22-year-old woman who had been employed for 6 months. She moved through the rooms like a ghost, her presence barely noticed by the man who signed her modest wages. Nina wore the same black uniform every day, pressed and clean despite its frayed edges. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a simple bun, and her worn sneakers made no sound on the polished floors. She arrived at 6 each morning and left at 4, never speaking unless spoken to, never taking breaks longer than necessary. Lately, Robert had noticed something odd. Multiple times each day, Nina would slip into the kitchen and open the massive stainless steel refrigerator. She would stand there for several minutes, scanning the shelves with unusual intensity, then close the door and return to her work. She never took anything, never even touched the expensive imported foods. But her behavior gnawed at Robert's suspicious mind. The refrigerator was always stocked with more food than Robert could ever consume. Fresh salmon from Scotland, organic vegetables from exclusive farms, artisanal cheeses, and delicate pastries from the finest bakeries. Most items expired before he even remembered they were there. His chef, Marcel, replaced everything weekly, discarding whatever remained. On this particular Tuesday morning, Robert decided to observe Nina more closely. He positioned himself in his home office where he could see the kitchen through the glass partition. Like clockwork, Nina appeared at 9:30, pushing her cleaning cart. She dusted the counters methodically, then approached the refrigerator. Robert watched as she opened the door and began examining items one by one. She picked up a container of organic strawberries, studied the date, then moved to check the milk, the yogurt, even the leftover takeout from his dinner 2 nights prior. Her movements were careful, almost reverent, as if she were handling precious artifacts rather than food destined for the garbage. This continued for nearly 10 minutes. Nina would lift items, examine them closely, sometimes even smelling them, before returning them to their exact positions. When she finished, she stood motionless for a moment, staring at the abundance before her, then quietly closed the door and resumed her cleaning. Robert felt his jaw clench. Was she planning something, cataloging his possessions? Perhaps she was, working with others, preparing for some elaborate theft. His business success had come from trusting no one and expecting the worst from everyone. This strange ritual confirmed his darkest suspicions. The next morning he positioned security cameras with better angles on the kitchen. For 3 more days, he watched the same scene unfold. Nina would approach the refrigerator with the same careful attention, examining expiration dates, studying the food with an expression Robert couldn't quite interpret. Was it longing, planning, guilt? His suspicions reached a breaking point on Friday afternoon. Robert had dismissed his afternoon meetings and waited in his office, watching the kitchen like a hawk watches prey. At exactly 2:15, Nina entered with her cleaning supplies. She moved efficiently through her routine until she reached the refrigerator. This time, Robert decided to confront her directly. He strode from his office into the kitchen just as Nina opened the refrigerator door. She was holding a container of expensive Greek yogurt, reading the expiration date with focused concentration. "What exactly do you think you're doing, Robert?" Voice cut through the silence like a blade. Nina spun around, nearly dropping the yogurt container. Her face drained of color, and she fumbled to return the item to its shelf. "Mr. Sterling, I was just cleaning. I was checking to see if anything needed to be thrown away." Thrown away? Robert stepped closer, his presence intimidating in the spacious kitchen. "That's not your job. Marcel handles all food management. Your job is to clean, not to rifle through my personal belongings." "I wasn't rifling, sir. I was only checking the dates because sometimes things sit too long and they spoil, and I thought maybe I could help by letting Marcel know." Robert's eyes narrowed. Her explanation sounded rehearsed. "Too convenient. You've been doing this every day for weeks. I've been watching you, standing here, examining everything, making mental notes. What's your real purpose?" Nina's hands trembled slightly as she stepped away from the refrigerator. "I promise you, Mr. Sterling, I wasn't doing anything wrong. I would never take anything that wasn't mine, wouldn't you?" Robert moved closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "A young woman from your background, working in a house like this, surrounded by more wealth than she's ever seen. But temptation must be overwhelming. Tears began to form in Nina's eyes, but she held her ground. I'm not a thief, sir. Then explain this obsession with my food. Explain why you spend 10 minutes every day cataloging my refrigerator contents. Explain why you handle items with such familiarity, as if you're already planning how to use them. Nina opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. How could she explain without sounding like she was making excuses? How could she tell this powerful, wealthy man about the 3 children down the hall from her apartment who sometimes had nothing to eat? How could she describe the shame of watching Tommy cry from hunger while she worked in a kitchen filled with more food than 20 families could consume? I can't explain it in a way you'd understand, she finally whispered. Try me, Robert demanded. Nina looked at the floor, her voice barely audible. You wouldn't believe me even if I told you. You're right, Robert said coldly. I don't believe. You and I don't need to understand. What I need is for you to pack your things and leave my house immediately. You're fired. The words hit Nina like physical blows. She had known this moment might come, had prepared herself for it, but the reality was still devastating. This job was her lifeline, her only source of income in an expensive city that showed no mercy to people like her. Please, Mr. Sterling, she said quietly, I need this job. You should have thought of that before you started planning whatever scheme you're running. Robert turned away, dismissing her with his posture. I want you gone within the hour. Nina stood frozen for a moment, then nodded silently. She gathered her cleaning supplies with shaking hands and walked toward the service elevator. Robert watched her go, feeling satisfied that he had prevented whatever crime she was planning. But as the elevator doors closed behind Nina's small figure, something twisted uncomfortably in his chest. She hadn't argued, she hadn't begged or made excuses or tried to negotiate. She had simply accepted his judgment with the quiet dignity of someone accustomed to life's cruelties. Robert pushed the feeling aside and returned to his office. He had protected his property and maintained the boundaries that kept his world secure. Whatever sob story Nina might have invented, whatever manipulation she might have attempted, he had seen through it all. By evening, Nina Rodriguez was gone, taking with her the truth that would have shattered Robert Sterling's cold assumptions about the world. The discovery Mrs. Thompson had worked for wealthy families for 37 years, and in all that time, she had never seen anything quite like what happened with Nina Rodriguez. The head housekeeper had silver hair pulled back in a dignified bun and eyes that missed nothing. She had watched the young maid's dismissal with growing unease, knowing something wasn't right about the whole situation. For 2 days after Nina's firing, Mrs. Thompson went about her duties with a heavy heart. She supervised the other staff, managed household schedules, and maintained the pristine condition that Robert Sterling demanded. But she couldn't shake the image of Nina's face when she was accused, the quiet acceptance of a judgment that seemed so unfair. On Sunday evening, Mrs. Thompson made a decision that would change everything. She had Nina's address from the employment files, and after finishing her duties, she took the subway to Queens. The neighborhood was a stark contrast to Sterling's Manhattan penthouse. Cracked sidewalks, buildings with chipped paint, and the constant sound of traffic created a harsh urban symphony. Nina's building was a 5-story walk-up with a broken intercom system. Mrs. Thompson climbed to the 3rd floor, following apartment numbers until she found 3B. She could hear voices through the thin door. Children's voices mixed with Nina's gentle responses in Spanish. When Nina opened the door, her surprise was complete. Mrs. Thompson, how did you find me? Is something wrong? May I come in, dear? I think we need to talk. Nina's apartment was smaller than Robert Sterling's walk-in closet. The main room served as living room, dining room, and kitchen combined. A pull-out couch dominated the space, and a tiny kitchenette occupied one corner. Despite the cramped conditions, everything was spotlessly clean and organized with the same care Nina had shown at the mansion. But what caught Mrs. Thompson's attention were the 3 children sitting at a small folding table, sharing what appeared to be a single can of soup divided into 3 bowls. The oldest, a boy of about 7 with dark hair and serious eyes, looked up when the women entered. 2 smaller children, a girl around 5 and a toddler barely 2 years old, continued eating with the focused intensity of those who never know when the next meal might come. Tommy, Sophia Louise, Nina said softly, this is Mrs. Thompson from where I used to work. The older boy, Tommy, studied Mrs. Thompson with wisdom beyond his years. Are you here to help Nina get her job back? Mrs. Thompson felt her heart break. A little at the question, she looked around the sparse apartment, taking in the details Nina would never have shared. The children's clothes were clean but patched. The refrigerator was clearly empty except for basic necessities. A small pile of unpaid bills sat on the counter next to a calculator and a notebook where Nina had been working out her remaining money. Nina, Mrs. Thompson said gently, "These children, are they yours?" Nina shook her head. "They're from down the hall. Their father works nights when he can find work, but he drinks most of what he earns. Their mother left last year. I just help when I can." "Help how?" Nina hesitated, then spoke quietly so the children wouldn't hear. "Sometimes they don't have food for days. When I worked at Mr. Sterling's house, there was always food being thrown away. Fresh food, barely expired, items that were still perfectly good. I would check the dates to see what Marcel was going to discard, and I would ask if I could take those items instead of them going in the garbage." Mrs. Thompson felt the pieces clicking into place. "You were checking expiration dates?" "Yes. I never took anything that was still good, only things that were going to be thrown away anyway. Yogurt that was 1 day past date, bread that was getting stale, fruits that had a few soft spots, things that were still nutritious but couldn't be served to Mr. Sterling." "And you fed these children with that food?" Nina nodded, tears beginning to flow. "I know it was wrong to take anything without permission. I know I should have asked first, but they were so hungry, and there was so much food just going to waste. I thought if I was careful, if I only took things that were going to be discarded, anyway, maybe it would be okay." Mrs. Thompson looked at the children, who had finished their meager meal and were now quietly coloring with worn crayons on the back of used paper. She thought of the Sterling mansion, where the refrigerator was restocked weekly with hundreds of dollars worth of food, most of which ended up in the garbage. "You lost your job because you were feeding hungry children with food that would have been thrown away. I lost my job because I was acting suspicious and Mr. Sterling thought I was planning to steal from him. He was right to be suspicious. I was taking things without permission, even if they were just scraps." Mrs. Thompson sat heavily in the apartment's only chair. The injustice of the situation was overwhelming. A young woman had lost her livelihood because she couldn't bear to watch children starve while abundance was being wasted mere feet away. "Nina, why didn't you explain this to Mr. Sterling when he confronted you?" Nina wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "What was I supposed to say? That I was taking his food to feed other people's children? That I was making decisions about his property without his permission? He already thought I was a thief. The truth would have just confirmed it in his mind. But you weren't stealing for yourself. In the eyes of the law, it doesn't matter who you steal for. Taking something without permission is stealing, regardless of the reason." Mrs. Thompson watched as Tommy approached Nina with a drawing he had made. It showed stick figures holding hands under a rainbow, with "Thank you, Nina" written in careful child's handwriting. The little boy hugged Nina's legs, and she lifted him onto her lap despite her own troubles. "We heard you crying last night," Tommy said softly. "Are you sad because you can't bring us food anymore?" Nina's composure cracked completely. "I'm sorry, Tommy. I'm so sorry I can't help you anymore." Mrs. Thompson felt anger building in her chest, anger at the unfairness of a system that criminalized compassion while allowing abundance to rot in garbage cans. She thought of Robert Sterling in his mansion, surrounded by more wealth than he could ever use, completely unaware of the struggling family just a few miles away. "Nina," Mrs. Thompson said firmly, "you're coming with me tomorrow morning." "Where?" "Back to see Mr. Sterling. He needs to hear the truth, the whole truth. What he does with that information will show what kind of man he really is." Nina shook her head. "He won't listen, and even if he does, it won't change anything. I still took things without permission." "Maybe not," Mrs. Thompson said, standing with renewed purpose. "But he deserves to know that he fired someone for the crime of having too much compassion, and you deserve the chance to tell your story to someone who has the power to understand the difference between greed and grace." That night, Mrs. Thompson couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the children sharing that single can of soup, about Nina's quiet dignity in the face of accusation, about Robert Sterling's cold certainty that he had prevented a crime. Tomorrow, she would present him with a different kind of truth, one that would force him to confront the real meaning of his actions. The revelation was coming, and with it, the possibility of redemption for everyone involved. The redemption Monday morning arrived gray and cold, matching the somber mood in Robert Sterling's penthouse. He sat in his home office, reviewing quarterly reports, but found himself distracted by the unusual quiet in the mansion. The cleaning routine felt different without Nina's almost invisible presence moving through the rooms. Mrs. Thompson had requested an urgent meeting, something she had never done in her 5 years of service. Robert respected her professionalism and agreed to see her at 10 o'clock, though he couldn't imagine what could be so important that when she entered his office, Mrs. Thompson carried herself with a dignity that commanded attention. Her usual deference was replaced by something stronger, more determined. "Mr. Sterling," she began without preamble, "I need to tell you about Nina Rodriguez." Robert's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Thompson, that matter is closed. I don't discuss former employees. With respect, sir, this matter is far from closed. You made a decision based on incomplete information, and the consequences extend far beyond these walls." Robert set down his papers, annoyed by her persistence. "I saw what I saw. She was systematically going through my refrigerator, cataloging contents, clearly planning something. I prevented a theft before it could occur." "You prevented nothing, sir, you destroyed everything." The quiet force in Mrs. Thompson's voice made Robert pause. In 5 years, she had never spoken to him this way. "Yesterday evening," she continued, "I visited Nina's apartment in Queens. What I found there will haunt me for the rest of my life." She described the cramped apartment, the 3 hungry children, the empty refrigerator, and Nina's careful explanation of her actions. As she spoke, Robert felt something cold settle in his stomach. "She was checking expiration dates," Mrs. Thompson said, "not to steal fresh food, but to identify items that Marcel was going to discard anyway. She was feeding 3 children with food that would have otherwise gone into the garbage." Robert stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the city without seeing it. "That's impossible. She never asked permission. She never explained, double quotes. How could she explain? A young woman from her background asking a billionaire if she could take his discarded food to feed hungry children. She was terrified you'd see her as a beggar or a charity case. So she chose to act suspiciously instead. She chose to save 3 children from starvation using resources that had no other purpose than filling a landfill." Robert turned back to face Mrs. Thompson. "Even if that's true, she should have asked. She should have been honest. Should she?" Mrs. Thompson's eyes flashed with uncharacteristic fire. "Tell me, Mr. Sterling, when was the last time you asked about your employees' lives? When did you ever create an environment where someone like Nina could approach you with a problem?" The question hit Robert like a physical blow. He realized he couldn't even remember Nina's last name without checking the files. He had never asked about her background, her family, or her circumstances outside of work. 3 days ago, Mrs. Thompson continued, Tommy, the 7-year-old, asked me if I was there to help Nina get her job back. A child understands that Nina needs work to help them, but the man who fired her never bothered to learn why she needed that work so desperately. Robert sank back into his chair, feeling the weight of realization settling on his shoulders. Where is she now? Applying for jobs she's unlikely to get, with no reference from her most recent employer. She has $12 left and 3 children depending on her kindness. The silence in the office stretched between them like a chasm. Robert thought about the abundance in his kitchen, the weekly waste, the casual disposal of resources that could have meant the difference between hunger and nourishment for a struggling family. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly. "I want you to meet them," Mrs. Thompson said. "I want you to see what your decision really meant." An hour later, Robert Sterling stood outside a crumbling building in Queens, holding bags of groceries that felt inadequate in his hands. The neighborhood was a revelation of urban struggle he had never bothered to notice from his corporate tower or penthouse windows. Nina answered the door on the 3rd knock, her surprise complete when she saw Robert standing in the hallway with Mrs. Thompson. "Mr. Sterling, I don't understand. May I come in? I think we need to talk." The apartment was even smaller than Mrs. Thompson had described. Robert, accustomed to rooms measured in thousands of square feet, felt claustrophobic in the tiny space. But what struck him most were the children, who regarded this strange man with the wariness of those who had learned not to trust easily. Tommy, the oldest, stepped protectively in front of his younger siblings. "Are you here to hurt Nina?" The question pierced Robert's heart. "No, Tommy, I'm here to apologize to her." Robert set the grocery bags on the small counter and turned to face Nina. She stood with quiet dignity, waiting for whatever judgment he had come to deliver. "I was wrong," Robert said simply. "I accused you without understanding. I fired you without listening. I saw suspicious behavior and assumed the worst without ever considering that your motives might have been noble." Nina's eyes filled with tears, but she remained silent. "Mrs. Thompson told me about the children, about the food waste, about what you were really doing in my kitchen." Robert's voice grew thick with emotion. "You were trying to save lives with resources I was throwing away, and I punished you for it. You had every right to be suspicious," Nina said softly. "I was taking things without permission. You were preventing waste while feeding hungry children. There's a difference, and I should have been wise enough to see it. Robert knelt down. To Tommy's level, your friend Nina is a hero. She risked her job to make sure you and your sister and brother had food to eat. I was too blind to see that. Tommy studied Robert's face with serious eyes. Nina cries sometimes when she thinks we're sleeping. She worries about us. The simple statement broke something inside Robert's chest. He looked up at Nina, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time, not as an employee or a potential threat, but as a young woman carrying burdens far beyond her years, sacrificing her own security for the welfare of children who weren't even her own. Nina, Robert said, standing slowly, I want to offer you your job back, with a substantial raise. But more than that, I want to offer you something else. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. This is a scholarship application for the culinary program at the Institute of Culinary Education. Full tuition, plus a living stipend. When you graduate, there will be a position waiting for you, managing the community outreach program I'm starting. Nina stared at the envelope as if it might disappear. I don't understand. I'm starting a foundation to address food waste and hunger in the city. You'll help design programs to redirect surplus food from restaurants and grocery stores to families who need it. You'll turn your compassion into a career that can help thousands of families like Tommy's. Sophia, the 5-year-old, tugged on Robert's expensive coat. Does this mean Nina won't be sad anymore? Robert looked down at the little girl with her hopeful eyes and felt his carefully constructed walls crumble completely. I hope so, sweetheart. I really hope so. Over the following weeks, Robert found himself transformed by the experience. He visited Nina's neighborhood regularly, meeting other families struggling with food insecurity. He saw how small acts of kindness could ripple outward, creating waves of positive change. The Sterling Foundation launched 3 months later, with Nina as its first program coordinator. She had moved to a better apartment but remained close to Tommy, Sophia and Luis, who now had reliable meals and a support system that extended far beyond one person's compassion. Robert learned the names of all his employees and instituted programs to support their families. His mansion's kitchen became a distribution center for a network that prevented thousands of pounds of food waste while feeding hundreds of families. Each week, on the foundation's opening day, Robert stood before a crowd of donors and community members, but his eyes found Nina in the audience, sitting with Mrs. Thompson and the 3 children who had unknowingly changed his entire perspective on wealth and responsibility. 6 months ago, Robert said into the microphone, I thought I was protecting my property from theft. Today I understand that I was actually preventing myself from discovering the true meaning of abundance. Real wealth isn't measured by what we accumulate, but by what we share. And real security comes not from building walls, but from building communities. The applause was warm, but Robert barely heard it. He was watching Tommy raise his small hand in a thumbs-up gesture, and Nina wiping tears of joy from her eyes. Later that evening, as Robert returned to his penthouse, he opened the refrigerator and smiled. It was still full of abundance, but now that abundance had purpose beyond his own consumption. Tomorrow, Nina would come by to collect items approaching their expiration dates, and those items would find their way to families who would treasure every bite. The mansion felt different, now, warmer somehow, filled with the knowledge that its resources served a greater purpose. Robert had learned that true wealth comes not from having everything you want, but from ensuring that others have everything they need. And in a small apartment in Queens, 3 children fell asleep with full bellies and the security of knowing that kindness, once planted, grows into something beautiful and sustaining for everyone it touches. The end.